With its hip neighborhoods and soaring high-rises, there are dwindling signs in today's Brooklyn of the borough's past as a center of heavy industry. But the connections are there, the good ones like budding new manufacturing and old factory buildings, and the bad, areas of the borough that have been polluted by long-gone companies and long-outdated infrastructure. In 3 areas of Brooklyn, along the Gowanus Canal, in Newtown Creek, and at the Wolf Alport site right on Bushwick's border with Queens, this tainted legacy is so extensive the feds have declared them Superfund sites and begun a long process of research and remediation. Today, we're going to find out where that process stands and what impact it's having on neighborhoods. And so we're glad to be joined by Professor Joshua Cheng, Director of the Environmental Sciences Analytical Center at Brooklyn College. Hi, Professor.
Hi.
Michelle De La Uz, who as Executive Director of the Fifth Avenue Committee has been monitoring the Gowanus project. Welcome back to BK Live, Michelle.
Thank you.
And Willis Elkins, a member of the Newtown Creek Alliance. Thanks for joining us, Willis.
Thank you.
Professor Cheng, we should mention that we tried to find someone from the Wolf Alport site. That's a new site. It's in kind of a funky area, but the EPA recently put out a report talking about the radioactive activity at that site and said that, putting shields in place and measures to reduce radon gas has reduced but not eliminated the health risk. So what is the purpose of Superfund? What are we trying to achieve, and how does the program work to try to get there?
Well, I think I can speak a little bit in general as to the Superfund program itself. This is a Superfund site in general, it's a contaminated site that is identified by EPA, and because it poses the health risk to human or animals or the environment, and then it has to be placed on the national priority list. It's called NPL to be a Superfund site. So right now, in the United States, have about 1,300 Superfund sites around the country. And if you look at the map of where these Superfund sites are, we have a very high density in the northeastern United States, especially in New Jersey and New York. So that's about, so Superfund, the designation of Superfund site allows the EPA to step in to do a very thorough investigation and develop a plan for remediation and make sure that it's cleaned up before it's put back to use for construction for any other kind of land use.
And so, Willis, at Newtown Creek, what does that process look like so far?
Well, we got our designation in 2010, and we're still in the remedial investigation phase, which means the contractors of the EPA have gone out and spent about 2 or 3 years collecting lots and lots of data about what the contamination is, where it's most concentrated, and then from that they'll be putting forth a plan of cleanup. But a lot of the pollution comes from the historic industrial uses, specifically petroleum and heavy metal production and stuff like that. So it's pretty severe, but a lot of it's also at the bottom of the creek in the sediment. So we're still in the next few years, we'll be analyzing, looking at the data and working with EPA to come up with the solutions of how to clean it up. And
figuring out also who's supposed to pay for it, right? That's part of the process.
Yeah, so that's a big process, is that you identify what are called PRPs, potentially responsible parties. And for Newtown Creek, we have 6 of those. A lot of those are mega corporations, as well as the city of New York, because of their sewage system, which has dumped untreated sewage and runoff into the creek for well over 100 years.
And Michelle, I know City of New York is also one of the parties in the Gowanus area.
That's right.
When the EPA was talking about making that a Superfund site, the city under Mayor Bloomberg was resistant. They thought that would slow down their efforts to clean up that area. Is that a concern that you and others in the community had, and has that played out at all? Where does that stand?
Well, first off, the Gowanus Canal Superfund site is the first Superfund site in New York City, and it was also designated in 2010. And it's actually the most densely populated Superfund site in the country. And the reality is that the EPA has really established a very aggressive timeline to complete the cleanup of the Gowanus Canal. And right now we're in the remedial design phase. We've already had a record of decision, the phase that was mentioned earlier for Newtown Creek. We're basically one step beyond that for Gowanus Canal. And the hope is to be complete with the full remediation of the canal in 2021. So I think that a lot of the fears that some people had, and certainly that the prior administration had about slowing down a cleanup process, is not coming true for the Gowanus Canal, and is something that no community member wants. I mean, the reality is the community has been living with the vestiges of the industrial uses and the contamination for many, many decades, and we want to see it clean up as quickly as possible, but also as thoroughly as possible, with significant community input. And the Gowanus Canal Community Advisory Group, of which I'm a member, has over 50 members. It's the largest CAG in the country. And so, getting everybody's buy-in is really a significant part of the process.
So far, I think that the preliminary plan or the plans as they stand call for moving something like 600,000 cubic yards of sediment, maybe a price tag of $500 million. Professor, for lay people, we talk about cleaning up a site that suggests, wiping it off with a damp cloth. Right. I'm assuming that's something. So what is involved with the Superfund cleanup? Is it about removing bad stuff? Is it about purifying it? Or is it about just covering up and hope that it doesn't bother us anymore?
Well, briefly speaking, it can be everything. So whatever it takes to remove all the contaminated media, or treat the media to make it to contaminant level down to the level that they consider no health risk. So these are they set the goals during the Superfund process, basically. So you clean it up and reach that goal, so you consider it done. So there's a lot of work needs to be done in there. For example, to investigate a site, you have 4 different aspects of things to look into. One of those is to look at the site conditions, whether it's a river, it's a lake, or it's something, a geology kind of thing in there, and then look at the type of contaminants, level of contaminants, and the special distribution of contaminants. And then look at also the cost, treatability studies, for example, whether they can do it, and how much does it cost, and how long does it take to treat it. And also, comprehensively speaking, you have to look at the actual health risk to human and to the environment. So it's a very comprehensive thing, and there may be various technologies that has to be involved to get to clean up each of these media, basically, to contain the contamination and then minimize the health risk in the end.
And the health risk, we should talk about that, because I know at the Gowanus site there was the question of when you take the bad stuff out of where it currently is, where do you process it? That was a whole sort of separate debate. What do we know about health risks now? What has been studied about the effect that these areas were having on their surrounding community as they
Sure.
exist? What effect the cleanup might have? What the future might look like? What are the risks?
The risk, as it relates to the Gowanus Canal, really had to do with folks coming in contact with the sediment or the raw sewage in the Gowanus Canal. And the Gowanus Canal remains a navigable waterway to this day, but despite certain attempts, people don't swim in the Gowanus Canal. People should not eat fish from the Gowanus Canal. And there could be health risks associated with swimming or with eating fish from the Gowanus Canal. And really the cleanup plan, which for the Gowanus Canal involves dredging and capping and also stopping the source materials from going into the canal. And the primary source materials are really 3 former manufactured gas plant sites that are along the canal that have long been disbanded, are no longer used, but there's like liquid petroleum, if you will. Liquid tar that is very, very deep in the ground that continues to leach into the canal, and raw sewage. Like Newtown Creek, there's also an issue with raw sewage in the Gowanus Canal. So that has to be contained in retention tanks in addition to the other pieces. So, the reality is that the EPA has laid out a plan that would mitigate and clean up all of those things. And the upland portion on the Gowanus Canal is under the jurisdiction of the State Department of Environmental Conservation. The canal itself is under EPA jurisdiction. But there is really significant coordination that needs to go on between all levels of government in order to have this cleanup be fulfilled.
Willis, what's the goal in Newtown Creek? Is it to achieve a waterway that we can look at and it won't gross us out, or do we want to actually go into it?
I don't want to speak for everybody in the community. I think that's something we're working through now, is to find a consensus of a vision we can all agree on. But I think so far we really want to see something that is restored to conditions as close as we can to sort of pre-industrial levels in terms of contamination. So we want to make sure there's not a health risk for anybody who comes in contact with the water or with the sediment. But there's also a interest that the community's really been robbed of what was there before the Industrial Revolution. This was a vast salt marsh ecosystem, and a lot of people, the native tribes that lived nearby as well as people that settled there, subsisted off of some of those populations of fish and oysters and stuff like that. And so to just clean up the contamination and move it out and not address the natural ramifications that have happened as well, so we want to see a restoration effort take place as well throughout parts of the creek.
And we should say that the Superfund process is one of only a few going on. There's also the long-term control plans around the city's CSOs.
Right.
There's, I know in area adjacent to Newtown Creek, there's the oil spill remediation, which is, I guess, somewhat connected. So this is not happening in a vacuum.
Well, it's like at Gowanus, you have all these upland sites of contamination, and with Newtown Creek, like Gowanus, like a lot of parts of New York and New Jersey, there's a lot of contamination in the ground, and it's very difficult to really properly assess how that contamination might be feeding into the waterways. So it presents a lot of tricky aspects. Also with the, as we mentioned, the sewage, that is technically something to be remediated under the Clean Water Act, which is a separate federal jurisdiction. However, there's a lot of overlap because with sewage there might also be coming chemical contaminants as well. So there's a lot of different agencies, and it gets very complicated, and sometimes that can be really frustrating for community members that we just want to see the place cleaned up. And if we say we want this cleaned up and then an agency says, well, that's not our problem, go talk to these guys, and they say, well, that's not our problem, go talk to these guys, it can be kind of frustrating. So we want to see a real comprehensive coordination amongst the agencies and responsible parties.
One thing that's interesting about these sites, I guess less so maybe the Bushwick site, is that they're in areas that are kind of hot, right? These are some of the areas that are being displaced, gentrified, whatever the word you want to use. What impact do you think the Superfund project has had on that? Has it slowed it down? Has it exacerbated? Is there any connection between development patterns and what's going on in the waterway?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is that, you know, as the population in the city of New York grows, land that previously developers didn't develop on because it was too complicated or too costly to develop on, that's the last frontier, basically. You know, brownfield sites, you know, sites adjacent to Superfund sites are really the last frontier. I think there was a concern when the designation was made in 2010, which was obviously during the recession, that the Superfund designation for the canal was going to have a cooling effect on the real estate development boom that was going on. And the reality is it's hard to tease out what part of that was the designation and what part of that was just the fact that we were having a great recession. Regardless, the Bloomberg administration at that time, they were planning to rezone the area around the Gowanus Canal, and they took the EPA's designation as a Superfund site to basically say this is too complicated for us to do right now. You know, there's no question that there's a lot of interest, obviously, to redevelop areas along the Gowanus Canal. And I think the fact that there has been an engaged group of stakeholders and, quite honestly, a subsequent Bridging Gowanus process, which is a community planning process to vision for the Gowanus, means there's a lot more consensus about what the community wants to see out of any redevelopment in the Gowanus that had existed prior. So hopefully that means that whatever happens in the future no matter what, the cleanup is good for the community, you know, whether or not development happens. Obviously, one day development will happen.
Professor, a quick answer to a very complicated question. You've written about the broader issue of heavy metal contamination in city soil.
Right.
So are Superfund sites sort of the only things for us to worry about, or are they just sort of the biggest icebergs in a sea of potential contamination in the city?
Well, I think that's a really good question, actually. For us, you know, people living in the city, we're unfortunate to be left with so much different contaminants and almost everywhere in people's backyards, the community gardens, and so forth. And people, you know, there are two sides of it. One is that you can't, you know, get too nervous or get too frustrated about it because that's the reality. The two is that you have to look at the actual health risk with different type of contaminations, different type of contaminants or different levels or different places. What you do with the soil, with the place, is what determines what the health risks are. So placing things on the national priority list really, you know, helps to deal with this like a centralized, you know, bigger problems. But so to spread it out, and I think people just have to take different approaches to be careful to minimize their own health risk. So, you know, it's, yeah, go ahead.
So final topic is money. One of the concerns with Superfund was that the national fund has been kind of tapped out. That was raised about all the New York City sites. Given where we are in the process of finding responsible parties, have we sort of put those fears aside, or is that still a concern? Will the money be there when we need it to pay for the cleanup?
For the Gowanus Canal, there are literally several dozen PRPs, with the biggest ones being National Grid, because of the manufactured gas plant sites that were along the canal. And the city of New York is a pretty significant PRP as well.
And Greenpoint? I mean, Newtown Creek?
In Newtown Creek, well, we have much fewer. There's only 6 PRPs, but we're also dealing with some of the largest companies that have ever existed, like ExxonMobil. So on one hand, it seems like there might be a lot of money. On the other hand, we've seen from other sites that some entities will spend as much money to delay a cleanup and to minimize a cleanup, you know, instead of spending the money on the cleanup themselves. So I think part of the issue is how Superfund has been operated nationally, and that the Superfund itself has kind of lost its funds, and now we're in a situation where when you have a contaminated site, the federal government or the state government has to work with that party. And so there's less, the power situation has changed. It's more of a negotiation. And we're seeing this a lot on the Hudson River with GE right now, where a lot of people are saying the Hudson River is not completely clean. And GE sort of has more power than I think they should in negotiating, saying, no, we're fine. And it's, you know, to be determined what's going to happen there. But I think we need to re-examine how the Superfund works and go back to a model where there is a fund that can pay for these cleanups, and we're not, you know, sort of, please, corporation, clean this up, do good, but there's more enforcement action happening.
Right, well, hopefully we can use this show and City Limits to keep on folks, make sure that they send their checks to the right address. And thank you all for coming on to talk about this. It's a very important issue.